welcome. Before proceeding today, I'd like to thank Marilyn Nussbaum for her assistance in making my series of lectures possible. Indeed, I'd also like to thank her husband and brother who are here today and helped get us organized. The title of my lecture is Spirituality. It could be subtitled Spirituality for Believers and Non-Believers. And when I say believers and non-believers, what I'm talking about are people who believe in organized religion and those who don't believe in organized religion. So I hope that both groups of people today, if they are represented here, will benefit from this lecture. Another possible subtitle for the lecture, or possible title actually, would be Spirituality and Self-Fulfillment. There are many ways to approach the subject of spirituality, and none are written in concrete. I think I am accurate in saying that anytime anybody gives a lecture on spirituality, in one way or another, it involves an interpretation. And why is that so? Well, because unfortunately, there are few things in this world about which we can be certain. Indeed, even the scientist cannot base most of his daily living on scientific truths. I'll say that again. Even the scientist cannot base most of his own or her own daily living on scientific truths. Science, after all, cannot answer the most important questions in life, such as, how shall I live? What's the good life? Also, the scientist must answer for himself or herself questions such as, should I marry? If so, whom should I marry? How should I raise my children? Which house or apartment should I buy or rent? Should I try to be a decent human being? Or is it true that dishonest people laugh all the way to the bank? So you see, the scientist also, again, has to base most of his daily living on what would be considered less than scientific truth. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. Pretty powerful statement. The unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates believed that even when we cannot be certain, it is always better to think, to reason, to evaluate, than to live without introspection and reflection. My purpose today basically is twofold. It's to stimulate your thinking, to help us deal with the difficulties of life. And also, I hope that my lecture in some way will stimulate our thinking about what we can do to increase our possibilities for joy in this life. Among the significant questions I will try to address myself to today are the following. What is spirituality? What might motivate one to look to spirituality as a source of tranquility and joy? What is the path to spiritual growth? What is spiritual vision, and how does one acquire it? You know, sometimes people allude to people who apparently have spiritual vision. Well, what is that? I'll be talking about that later on. Also, perhaps the $64 question, and one in which I'll build to in terms of trying to answer it, is what constitutes spiritual knowledge? What constitutes spiritual knowledge? And I will, with some degree of specificity, try to address myself to that question. And finally, what are the characteristics of a spiritually advanced person, a spiritually realized person? Let's begin with the definition of the word spiritual. And I think the best way to introduce the word spiritual is to contrast it with the word material. If one checks the dictionary for spiritual, among the definitions, and they give many, are the following. Not tangible or material. Again, spiritual. Not tangible or material. Beyond sense impressions. Some people use the word invisible to describe what is spiritual. In contrast to what is material, if you check the dictionary to find out what material means, again, there are many definitions, but among them are the following. Material, of, relating to, or composed of matter. Of, relating to, or composed of matter. In the sense in which I'm using material, I'll be talking about things, cars, computers, cell phones. They're not spiritual, they are material. They are things, they are visible. Again, some people choose, rightly or wrongly, to distinguish the spiritual from the material by using the words visible or invisible. It is interesting that even pre-Christian philosophers have used the word soul. Plato, in his writings, often uses the word soul. Aristotle, who was Plato's student, also a pre-Christian, so to speak. Aristotle also, time and again in his Ethics, uses the word soul. And I've often wondered, what exactly does he mean by that? I've read Aristotle, but he can be difficult in parts to read. So I'll defer to an expert on Aristotle. Mortimer Adler was a professor at the University of Chicago, now dead. He started the Great Books program at the University of Chicago. He was an acknowledged Aristotelian scholar, and he says this about Aristotle's use of the word soul. He said that Aristotle wrote of goods of the soul. We might refer to them as psychological goods. So again, he is suggesting, Professor Adler is, in fact, he's stating that as far as he's concerned, when Aristotle talks about goods of the soul, he's talking about psychological goods. And I'll have much more to say about that today. What I'd like to do now is to provide a working definition of spiritual knowledge. I mentioned later on the $64 question I'll be raising is what constitutes spiritual knowledge. And my working definition is this. It's knowledge of how to get more peace of mind. Spiritual knowledge. Knowledge of how to get more peace of mind. And I will try to make a case. I will try to make a case that this is an appropriate definition. What might motivate someone to look to spirituality in his or her life? Well, frustration, stress, despair. My guess is it's not unusual that people have been very successful in a material way and may have a beautiful automobile and a beautiful home or apartment and beautiful furniture, but they're still suffering a certain degree of despair, and they say to themselves, is that all there is? Is that all there is? Well, perhaps that thought could lead them to seek more joy in spirituality. A prominent Buddhist thinker, I think, provides some illumination here. He said this, deep inside, every one of us is carrying a very heavy load. In spite of our smiling faces and dignified appearance. As human beings, it is natural that we feel anger and frustration and even hatred. We are trying to suppress it. Let me read those last two sentences again. And again, these are from a Buddhist, a very prominent Buddhist thinker. As human beings, it is natural that we feel anger and frustration and even hatred. We are trying to suppress it. Let me deal with the first question that I raised in my opening remarks, and that is, what is spiritual growth? What constitutes spiritual growth? Psychiatrist M. Scott Peck has said this, that spiritual growth is the same thing as mental growth. He equates spiritual growth with mental growth. In fact, let me quote psychiatrist M. Scott Peck. He says, I make no distinction between the process of achieving spiritual growth and achieving mental growth. They are one and the same thing. He goes on to say that we can define spiritual growth as the growth or evolution of consciousness. So psychiatrist Peck is saying, in his opinion, when we are growing spiritually, we are growing in consciousness. We are moving to higher levels of awareness. That is spiritual growth, in his opinion. It is interesting, if one wants to shed some light, perhaps, on what he means when he says spiritual growth involves moving to higher levels of consciousness. D.T. Suzuki is a very famous Zen Buddhist scholar, D.T. Suzuki. And he says that after one succeeds somewhat in moving to higher levels of consciousness, of awareness, he says we see differently. And he explains this. He says this, that again, after one achieves a certain level of spiritual growth, it's not that something different is seen, but that one sees differently. It's not that something different is seen, but that one sees differently. I alluded to M. Scott Peck before, the psychiatrist, who again said he equates spiritual growth with mental growth. He says that spiritual growth has two components. Peck says that spiritual growth has two components. Besides involving moving to higher levels of awareness, it also involves ever-increasing loving activity. Ever-increasing loving activity. So Peck would say, if you are growing spiritually, it means you're at a higher level of consciousness, of awareness than you might have been 5 years ago, and also that you're a more loving person, perhaps, than you were 5 years ago. What's the path to spiritual growth? What's the path to higher levels of awareness and ever-increasing loving activity? I think Ralph Waldo Emerson, very famous American writer, philosopher, he said this. He said if we want to grow spiritually, we must acquire living property. We must acquire living property. And you might ask, what is living property? We're all familiar with material property, land, buildings, furniture, material property. Well, what is living property? Emerson says, living property consists of clarifying thoughts and positive character traits. Clarifying thoughts and positive character traits. So it's possible one has material property, you own land, you own a house, you own furniture, but you might not have living property in the sense of having clarifying thoughts, thoughts that are helping you to get through the day with less stress and more joy. And perhaps you don't have positive character traits, because he says positive character traits also are part of living property. It is interesting, the Dutch Jew and very famous philosopher, Spinoza, in fact, the most famous philosopher to come out of Holland, which, as some of you know, is my home away from home. Spinoza equated spiritual growth with having adequate ideas. Again, he equated spiritual growth with having adequate ideas. Spinoza said the mass of people base their lives on inadequate ideas, and because of it they suffer. Whereas, he said, the spiritually realized person bases his or her life on adequate ideas. And he's very specific. He says that when we are subject to inadequate ideas, we are ruled by our emotions. Again, when inadequate ideas are controlling our lives, we are ruled by our emotions. He says that when we have adequate ideas, we direct our emotions. When we have adequate ideas, we direct our emotions. Also, he says that when we have inadequate ideas and base our lives on them, we suffer from our emotions. Whereby, or I should say whereas, if we have adequate ideas, we profit from our emotions. The Dalai Lama, in defining spirituality, has said this. The Dalai Lama has said that spirituality is a form of mental hygiene. Reminds me of Nietzsche. You know, Nietzsche studied Buddhism. Nietzsche was an atheist, as you probably know. He studied Buddhism. And he said, I don't really believe Buddhism should be considered a religion. Buddhism, Nietzsche said, is a system of mental hygiene. And the Dalai Lama, in a certain sense, is talking about that aspect of Buddhism. The Dalai Lama says that spirituality consists of attitudes and emotions. Spirituality consists of attitudes and emotions that are good for us. And among those attitudes and emotions that we should cultivate, according to the Dalai Lama, are the following: goodness, kindness, compassion, caring. So if you were talking to the Dalai Lama and you said, I want to grow spiritually, what should I do? The Dalai Lama would tell you, well, among the things you should do, to grow spiritually are to cultivate goodness, kindness, compassion, and caring. He would also tell you that you must cultivate inner discipline. You must cultivate inner discipline. That inner discipline is the basis of a spiritual life. And what does inner discipline involve? Inner discipline, according to the Dalai Lama, involves combating negative states of mind, such as greed, hatred, and lust. Again, inner discipline involves combating negative states of mind, such as greed, hatred, and lust, and cultivating positive states of mind, such as compassion and kindness. And Buddhists believe if we want to move to higher levels of spirituality, we must engage in mood monitoring and must engage in mindfulness. We must think about our thinking. The Buddhists say we must think about our thinking, which means that we should think about our thinking to the extent that we realize we're angry, we realize we are full of lust, we might realize that we are anxious, and the idea is if you're thinking about your thinking and you're more in touch with what you're feeling, well, then you can come up with some antidote. And through mood monitoring, through thinking about your thinking, you can move to a positive state of thought. The Dalai Lama has also said that we must wage war. We must wage war on our laziness, our anger and hatred, and our greed, and our self-centeredness. Allow me to say that again. The Dalai Lama has said that if we wish to be more spiritual, we must wage war on our laziness, our anger, our hatred, our self-centeredness. It is interesting how many philosophers, how many religionists talk about the danger of being self-centered, the danger of being egotistical. In fact, in the Old Testament, in the book of Proverbs, it says, and my guess is you're familiar with this quote, "Pride goes before ruin, arrogance before failure." Pride goes before ruin, arrogance before failure. And in the New Testament, Jesus says, "Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." And Hillel, perhaps the most famous of all Jewish sages, Hillel said this, and I know most of you are familiar with this: If I am not for me, who will be? But if I am for me alone, what am I? If I am for me alone, what am I? And we know in the Old Testament, the Hebrew prophets, time and again, talk about social justice. Perhaps there is no segment of any holy book ever written. Perhaps there is no segment of any holy book ever written that emphasizes social justice as much as the Hebrew prophets emphasize social justice, telling us we have to rise above being self-centered. We have to rise above just thinking about what's good for me and think about what's good for other people. And again, as I mentioned before, it is so interesting to me. It is so interesting to me that in my reading over the years, I find it's not just the religious writers who talk about the need to overcome self-centeredness. That the vast majority of the great philosophers, the vast majority of the great philosophers, some of whom didn't even believe in God, believed it is incumbent upon us to work at being less self-centered and to work at being more concerned about the welfare of other human beings. Also, if we are going to be less prideful, well, it means, of course, that we are going to have to cultivate humility. And what does humility involve? Well, among the things that humility involves is acknowledging our own sinfulness. Acknowledging our own sinfulness. We must not think that we are better than we are. You recall Jesus. Jesus said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. If we're going to become very spiritual persons, I think it's extremely important that we not think we are better people than we are, and also that we acknowledge that perhaps each of us sins every day. I know I do. I don't say that with false humility. I sin every day. I like to think, and maybe I'm lying, but I like to think I avoid sins of commission. But I know I don't avoid sins of omission. You all know we can sin by doing nothing. If people are being treated unjustly in New York, in the United States, elsewhere besides New York, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Holland, if people are being treated unjustly, and Phil doesn't even raise a pinky to address himself to their injustice, would even send money to some group maybe that's Friday. Well, I think if I have the money and or the time, and I do nothing, and some major injustice is being perpetrated, I am sinning. I am sinning by doing nothing. I think Christians, Jews, Muslims, many of us, I think, often forget. We probably all sin by omission at various times. The Quran, the Islamic holy book, which has gotten a lot of publicity in recent years, a lot of news coverage, it says that spiritual growth involves self-conquest. The Quran. Spiritual growth involves self-conquest. Let me quote you a line from the Quran that some people who are not familiar with this book might be astonished to hear. The Quran says about jihad, and I'm quoting it, the most excellent jihad, meaning struggle, is for the conquest of self. The most excellent jihad, jihad meaning struggle, is for the conquest of self. And there have been many Christian thinkers, many Jewish thinkers also, who have emphasized that expression of self-conquest. It's usually easier to exert power over oneself, over other people, excuse me. Usually it's easier to exert power over other people than over ourselves, and I'll be talking more about that later. We're talking about the path to spiritual growth. And I mentioned if we're going to move to higher levels of spiritual growth, if we're going to grow spiritually, if we are going to grow spiritually, I have mentioned it means achieving higher levels of awareness. It means developing positive character traits. It means engaging in increasing loving activity. I've emphasized that so far. Let me add something to the mix of acquiring more knowledge and becoming more loving. The Buddhists talk about the eightfold path to spiritual growth. The eightfold path. The Buddhists say, if you want to grow spiritually, what is extremely important, if you hope to succeed, is right association. Right association. It is interesting that often parents and grandchildren, parents and grandparents, are very concerned about who their children hang out with or who their grandchildren hang out with. Well, the Buddhists would say, I hope adults are paying as much attention to whom they hang out with. Because the Buddhists say that the people we regularly associate with have a significant effect on our consciousness and growth, for better or worse. I'll say it again. The people we regularly associate with have a significant effect on our consciousness and growth, for better or worse. And the Buddhists recommend that in choosing a friend, in choosing an acquaintance, in choosing somebody to hang with, to use the contemporary expression, that among the characteristics we should look for in people whose company might be desirable are the following. We should seek out virtuous people. We should seek out thoughtful, inquiring, reflective people. Again, seek out thoughtful, reflective, inquiring people. And also seek out compassionate people. Seek out compassionate people. The key is this. If our relationships are to prove valuable in helping us to grow spiritually, our relationships must be therapeutic. Our relationships must be therapeutic. My guess is there isn't anybody in this room who has not had an untherapeutic relationship. An untherapeutic relationship. So the key, I think, to determining whom we are going to associate with it is this. Is the person we are associating with, is that person's company restorative, inspiring, or is it draining? Is it draining? You know, if you're with somebody whose company is draining, well, maybe maybe it would be best not to hang out with that person unless you feel you can be of positive assistance to that person. But again, the Buddhists emphasize, if we are going to grow spiritually, it's extremely important that we not only acquire pertinent knowledge and become more loving, but it's also extremely important that we pay more attention to the kinds of people we associate with. Spiritual growth also involves a questioning attitude, a Socratic attitude. I don't think it's possible to grow spiritually if one is not inquisitive. And what should one question? Well, I guess practically everything. But let me give you specific examples. In our culture, and in other cultures as well, perhaps, I think it's important, if you want to grow spiritually, to question the version of the good life presented on television and in advertising. I'll say it again. It's very important to question the version of the good life provided on television and in advertising. Because it seems to me that if you accept what is generally presented as the good life on television and in advertising, my guess is that will probably interfere with you growing spiritually. It's also very important for us to be inquisitive about values that are very popular in our society. Again, it's very important that we reflect upon values that most people in America assume are the right values. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Let me give you examples. Conformity. Is conformity a good value? Should we base our lives on conforming to what the majority thinks and does? Is being popular a good value, a significant, a spiritual value? Is being popular a spiritual value? Is status seeking a value that will help us to achieve spiritual growth? Is competition? We live in a very, very competitive society. Is competitiveness conducive to growing spiritually? I'd like to address another question now. We've been talking about spiritual growth. Let me talk about spiritual vision. I mentioned some philosophers and religious writers use that expression, spiritual vision. Well, what is spiritual vision? I think Erich Fromm, the famous psychoanalyst, the late Erich Fromm, who wrote the best book I've ever read on love, a book called The Art of Loving. Erich Fromm, in The Art of Loving, says that spiritual vision involves looking beyond daily routine. Looking beyond daily routine to try to cultivate perspective. It involves trying to see the big picture. How often we see the trees but not the forest? Well, those who have spiritual vision are very good at seeing the forest. They don't just see the trees, they see the forest. And as a consequence, perhaps don't sweat the small stuff, to use a contemporary expression. I think art and religion can both be very helpful in enhancing our spiritual vision, in helping us to achieve perspective, in helping us to see the big picture. One of the things I have found helpful in trying to maintain perspective, because it's often difficult, we get involved in daily problems, we get anxious, we get nervous, and sometimes when we get anxious and nervous, we don't see clearly. One of the things I try to do each day is to remind myself to try to look at my life and the people I love and the world in general from a mountaintop. I try to pretend for a few minutes each day. It's kind of a form of meditation. But I'm on a mountaintop looking down at my life and the world in general. And I hope from that vantage point to see better, to see more. The Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is a very famous Hindu holy book. It talks about achieving spiritual vision. And it says this: if we want to get better at seeing spiritually, we must escape the clutches of material vision. We must escape the clutches of material vision. Let me quote the Bhagavad Gita, one of the most famous holy books in the world. The transcendental path is an attempt to escape the clutches of material vision to declare war against it. I'll say it again. The transcendental path is an attempt to escape the clutches of material vision to declare war against it. The Hindus characterize the world as Maya. They say the world appears the way we see it, but that's not the way it really is. Again, Hindus say that the way the world appears to us is not the way it really is. And if you acquire spiritual vision, you will see that the world really is not the way it appears to us. Remember, early on, I mentioned D.T. Suzuki, who said that when we grow spiritually, that after a while, it's not that something different is seen, but that we see differently. When we have spiritual vision, we see differently. Okay. Plato, whom I alluded to early on. Plato talks a lot about spiritual vision. I don't know if he uses that exact expression. He wrote in Greek, of course. But there's no question he talks about it. Plato says, if you want to acquire better vision, it's extremely important that you learn to see with your heart and your mind. If you want to see better, it's extremely important that you rise above just seeing with your eyes. Plato said our eyes often confuse us. We must see with our hearts and our minds. Let me quote Plato. Plato said, the eyes cannot see what is most beautiful. The eyes cannot see what is most beautiful. Only the mind can see what is most beautiful. And Plato went on to say that the highest form of beauty is goodness, moral truth. And you can't see goodness. You can't see moral truth. That these things we can see with our hearts, and these things we can see with our minds. Pascal, very famous French intellectual, and a very religious philosopher, by the way, devout Roman Catholic, and a mathematician as well, Pascal. Pascal said this, and I'm quoting him, "We know the truth not only through our reason, but also through our heart. We know the truth not only through our reason, but also through our heart." Let me bring some of this together. What I'm saying, in effect, is that if one wants to cultivate spiritual vision, it's important that one achieve a union of heart and mind. It's important that to a certain degree, one achieve a union of heart and mind, that you be able to see with your heart and mind. And you might think, well, that's not so important. Well, I think I can prove to you that it is important by asking you this question. What might a person be like? What might a person be like who is lacking this union of heart and mind? I submit to you, such a person might be all brain and no feeling. Such a person might be all brain and no feeling. Have you ever met people who may be very intellectual, very intelligent in a certain way, but seem to be lacking empathy, seem to be lacking compassion? It's as if they have no heart. In fact, the Quran, the Islamic holy book I referred to before, it talks about these kinds of people, and it says this, and I'm quoting the Quran. "It is not that their eyes are blind, but their hearts. It is not that their eyes are blind, but their hearts." Fred Heckinger, at one time, was the education editor of the New York Times. I don't know if he's still alive. But he wrote an article in the New York Times once about highly intelligent people and the suffering some of them cause in the world. And he said this, and I'm quoting Fred Heckinger, I think the late Fred Heckinger. He said this, "Much of the suffering in the world and in any community is caused by the highly intelligent who act without feeling and conscience." I'll say it again. Much of the suffering in the world is caused by the highly intelligent who act without feeling and conscience. Spinoza and the Buddhists, they say our intelligence must be guided by positive emotions. If we are to use our intelligence to benefit the world, if we are to use our intelligence to benefit the world, it must be positive emotions, not negative emotions, that are guiding our intelligence. If greed is guiding our intelligence, if status seeking is guiding our intelligence, if racism is guiding our intelligence, well, we know what the results will be. Whereas, if compassion, if affection, if love, concern for others, if that is guiding our intelligence, obviously the result is going to be quite different. So again, I am suggesting to you, if we are to achieve greater spiritual vision, if we want to see better, it's important that we not limit our sight to seeing just with our eyes, but that we learn to see with our hearts and with our minds. Also, another dimension of achieving spiritual vision is thinking about our own mortality. Thinking about our own mortality. I think it's fair to say that Americans in general don't like to think about death. And so many of the great thinkers, including Sigmund Freud, by the way, who's an atheist, including Freud, they believed it was a good idea to make a habit of thinking about death. Freud said that. Make a habit of thinking about death. He said, I've done that, and it's helped me to achieve perspective and to think more clearly about my own life. And you might wonder, what are the benefits? What are the benefits of making it a habit to think about death? Well, one of the benefits is that we might use our time more wisely, that we can realize that the amount of time we have to live in love is limited, and therefore we might not waste our time being angry, being envious, being anxious, being worrisome. And also, we must remember to love people today. We must remember to love people today because we or they or both of us may not be here tomorrow. And also, we should remember that death is the great equalizer. Death is the great equalizer. The physically beautiful die. The famous die. The rich die. The geniuses die. Death is the great equalizer. And finally, as I suggested to you before, perhaps the most significant advantage of making it a habit to think about death is it helps us to see our lives and the lives of people around us more clearly. What I'd like to do now is to talk about some aids to spiritual vision, some things that might assist us in acquiring spiritual vision. Again, I've talked about spiritual vision involving seeing with the mind, seeing with the heart, and having positive emotions guide our intelligence. Well, I think among the aids, among those things that can help us to see better, are solitude, quietness, stillness, and nature. I'll say it again. If you wish to increase your spiritual vision, if I wish to increase my spiritual vision, I think solitude can be very helpful. Quietness, stillness, and nature. Let me provide some illumination. Bertrand Russell, famous philosopher and an atheist, Russell said this: the good life is a quiet life. Let me give you his own words. The good life must, to a great extent, be a quiet life, for it is only in an atmosphere of quiet that true joy can live. It is only in an atmosphere of quiet that true joy can live. I think this would come as a shock to many Americans who are always on their cell phones, who always have the television on, who are always connected to the cell phone, and always believe it's extremely important to be connected to others, not to themselves, to others, not to themselves, which is the most important connection. Thomas Merton, very famous monk, Thomas Merton, was not a churchgoer, not even a Christian, not even a Catholic, not even a Catholic until his early 20s. Later became a Catholic monk, and he went to the monastery at Gethsemane in Kentucky, spent most of his adult life living there, and it's a very quiet place. One of the reasons the monastery is so quiet is the monks usually communicate with sign language. And the reason they do that is they want a very quiet atmosphere to exist there. Well, Thomas Merton wrote a classic book about his religious conversion, his conversion from being an agnostic to a Christian, in a book called The Seven-Story Mountain. I highly recommend it. And in this book, he talks about the first time he went to the monastery as a guest. And he talks about the silence and the stillness. Let me give you Thomas Merton's own words, this very famous monk's own words about the silence of the monastery. And the silence that enfolded me spoke to me, and spoke louder and more eloquently than any voice. Again, the silence that enfolded me spoke to me, and spoke louder and more eloquently than any voice. I wonder if Simon and Garfunkel read Thomas Merton's book, because as you know, Simon and Garfunkel have sung about the sounds of silence, the sounds of silence. I mentioned before that besides stillness, quietness, solitude, something else that can help enhance our spiritual vision is by being keen observers of nature. If you are a keen observer of nature, I'm not, by the way, but I'm trying to. If you become a keen observer, you will see that looking closely at nature, at trees, at mountains, thinking about the seasons, all of that will help you to increase your spiritual vision. And you might ask how. Phil, explain to me, how can becoming a student of nature, an observer of nature, how can that help me to increase my spiritual vision? Well, to explain this, I have to quote Ralph Waldo Emerson again. Remember I told you, Emerson, very famous American writer, a lecturer, poet. Emerson said this, and I just love this quote about nature. The keen observer of nature notices the immense unity in nature. He sees that the animals, the seasons, the mountains have a mysterious relation to his own life. Their growths and decays curiously resemble himself. Their growths and decays curiously resemble himself in whole or in part. He then says this: the world of nature is an immense picture book of every passage in human life. If you think about the animals, if you think about the seasons, again, he says, the world of nature is an immense picture book of every passage in human life. Emerson says, if you become a student of nature, which he was, as was Thoreau, to whom he was kind of a mentor, Emerson and Thoreau said, if you become a student of nature, that will help you to think about the eternal. It'll help you to think about the fundamental, in contrast to the transient. So often, we focus our minds on the transient. So often, again, we sweat the small stuff, focusing on what is passing. And Thoreau and Emerson are saying, one of the values of being a keen observer of nature is that it will help you to focus your attention on the eternal. And not only on the eternal, but the fundamental. What I'd like to do now is to get to the $64 question. And that is, what constitutes spiritual knowledge? What do people know who are spiritually realized, spiritually advanced? And as I indicated early on, this is an interpretation. Anytime anyone, I think, talks about spirituality, it's an interpretation, whether it's a priest, a rabbi, a minister, an agnostic, an atheist. Well, let me give you my version, and feel free later on to criticize my version, because I very much appreciate people stimulating my thinking. First, I think that spiritual knowledge consists of realizing that in the long run, virtue is more productive of tranquility and joy than status seeking. Let me say it again. I think the spiritually advanced person realizes that in the long run, virtue is more productive of tranquility and joy than social status. Plato talks a lot about old people in a part of the Republic. And he says, you know, when you're young and middle age, you don't think much about death. When you get to be old, you think a lot about death. And Plato says one of the great comforts in old age, one of the great comforts in old age, something that can give you tranquility in old age, is knowing you try to be a decent human being. Whereas, Plato says, if you are old and you have been a rip-off artist, Plato suggests you might have a lot of trouble sleeping. So again, Plato, a pre-Christian philosopher, is saying that virtue, in the long run, will help us achieve tranquility and joy. Secondly, if a person has spiritual knowledge, he realizes that self-conquest is much more satisfying than exerting power over others. I'll say it again. Self-conquest, which involves power over oneself. Power over oneself in terms of controlling one's emotions, that is much more satisfying than exerting power over others. I wonder how much power Saddam Hussein had over himself and his own negative emotions. And we all have negative emotions. Isn't it interesting that Saddam wielded great power, the power of life and death over other people. But again, I wonder how much power over himself he was able to achieve. Thirdly, I think that spiritual knowledge consists of knowing that loving people and being of service to people is far more satisfying than competing with people. Again, we can be primarily engaged in loving people and helping them, or our focus can be on competing with people. I wish to have a bigger house than my brother-in-law. I wish to have a bigger car than my neighbor. And I'm not so concerned about loving my brother-in-law. I'm not so concerned about loving my neighbor. It's competition, baby. That's what it's all about. Well, I am suggesting to you that the spiritually advanced person realizes that loving people and being of service to people is more satisfying than competing with people. Fourthly, I think it's important to realize that compassion is more productive of tranquility and joy than being aggressively ambitious. Again, being compassionate towards others. Being compassionate towards others, I am suggesting to you, is far more productive of joy than being aggressively ambitious with regard to other human beings. Fifthly, I suggest to you the state of one's soul. The state of one's soul can be much more satisfying to oneself than expensive items, than stuff, than owning a lot of stuff. Think about that. Do you think that's true? The state of one's soul can be a far greater source of tranquility and joy than owning a lot of stuff. Sixth, the spiritually advanced person, I think, realizes that genuine humility is more satisfying than excessive pride, than thinking I'm hot stuff. That if you try to achieve genuine humility, not phony humility, that's easy, phony humility, but genuine humility, that's far more satisfying than being engaged in ego trips on a daily basis. And finally, I say finally in my interpretation, actually there's no finally to this, it's open-ended, but I suggest to you that the spiritually advanced person realizes that reading illuminating books, meditating, praying, engaging in introspection can be far more valuable than countless hours watching television. I'll say it again. The spiritually advanced person realizes that reading illuminating books, meditating, praying, engaging in introspection can be far more satisfying than spending countless hours watching television. It seems to me one of the mistakes many people in our culture make, and probably in other cultures as well, they seem to focus much more on amusing themselves than on deepening themselves. And they don't seem to realize that deepening oneself can be far more satisfying, even entertaining in the long run, than amusing oneself. Professor Neil Postman, I think that's his name, New York University, wrote a book called Neil Postman. It is Postman, correct? Oh, so good to have students who are on the ball here. He wrote a book some years ago called Amusing Ourselves to Death about American society. He suggests in the book That's what too many Americans are doing, amusing themselves to death. And in amusing themselves, unfortunately, they're not deepening themselves, and they're suffering from it because they don't realize that deepening themselves would be far more productive of joy than simply amusing themselves. Now, you might wonder, what's the value of spiritual knowledge? What's the value of spiritual knowledge? Well, spiritual knowledge liberates. Spiritual knowledge liberates. It frees us from the bondage of habitual stress. It can help free us from greed, anger, envy, feelings of inferiority, feelings of loneliness. Sociologists tell us that loneliness is a major problem in American society, despite the fact we're so well connected, supposedly well connected. Well, it seems to me spiritual knowledge can help us feel less lonely. And also, of course, spiritual knowledge can help disabuse us of unrealistic expectations. Spiritual knowledge can help to free us about illusions we have about life. We all have mistaken ideas about life. We all have mistaken ideas about other people. We suffer from those illusions. We suffer from them. And I suggest to you, spiritual knowledge can help free us from mistaken ideas we have about life and about ourselves and our loved ones. Once having acquired spiritual knowledge, life will still be difficult. Life will still be difficult. But there will be more moments of tranquility, of joy. Spiritual knowledge can serve as a guide in coping with life's daily problems. Let me spend a couple of minutes on what might be the characteristics of the spiritually advanced person. I think it's fair to say the spiritually advanced person has as his or her daily guide virtue. Beethoven said, "I recognize no sign of superiority in mankind other than goodness." I recognize no sign of superiority in mankind other than goodness. Also, I think the spiritually advanced person seeks a transcendent vision. He or she has a cosmic perspective, sees not only the trees but the forest, and doesn't sweat the small stuff. Is the spiritually advanced person happy all the time? No. The spiritually advanced person is not happy all the time. Why not? Because he or she is a compassionate person. He or she often suffers when other people are suffering, whether it's reading about AIDS ravaging an entire nation or continent, or reading about wars or people being tortured. The spiritually advanced person suffers when he reads about that. But the spiritually advanced person can achieve a certain kind of peace perhaps others can't. It's the peace that's been described in this way. The spiritually advanced person is capable of the peace that passeth understanding. The spiritually advanced person is capable of the peace that passeth understanding. I'd like to close with a couple of quotations, which, as you know, is my habit. First, I'd like to quote the Buddha, because I think he provides a good summary to my lecture. I've talked about the importance of thoughts and emotions today. The Buddha talked about the power of our thoughts. The Buddha said this: "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. With our thoughts, we make the world. No computer, no cell phone, no fancy car in the world can exercise as much power over us as our thoughts." I'll say it again. No computer, cell phone, fancy car in the world can exert as much power over us as our thoughts. Think about this for a moment. Somebody driving a $60,000 car, but not being happy. Why? Because of his thoughts. He's thinking about the fact he's going to a job he hates to afford the $60,000 car. Or maybe his wife is sick. Or maybe one of his children is driving him crazy. So he's driving the $60,000 car, but it's not always making him happy. Because we are what we are thinking, aren't we? We are what we are thinking. So his thoughts have more control over him than a $60,000 car. Thomas Paine, famous American revolutionary, said this about religious duties. It's the best summary of religious duties I've ever read. Thomas Paine said this: "Religious duties consist of doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow human beings happy." I'll say it again. But instead of using his term, religious duties, I'm going to say spiritual duties. Spiritual duties consist of doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow human beings happy. And finally, a quote from Plotinus, very famous philosopher of antiquity. He says we should all be sculptors. What should we sculpt? Well, let me tell you. Again, this is Plotinus. Withdraw into yourself and look, and if you do not find yourself beautiful, yet act as does the creator of a statue. He cuts away here. He smooths there. He makes this line lighter, the other purer, until a lovely face has grown upon his work. So do you also. Cut away all that is excessive. Straighten all that is crooked. Straighten all that is crooked. And never cease chiseling. Never cease chiseling until you see the perfect goodness established in the stainless shrine. I thank you very much.